Golden State Media Concepts bring you Book Review Podcast, a haven for bookworms of all ages and the widest genres, from mystery to memoirs, romance to comedy, fantasy to sci-fi. If you love to read, this is a podcast for you. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Sarah. As always, I'm happy to be with you. I am happy to bring you another author interview. I hope you are having a great week so far. I hope you had a good weekend if you celebrated Easter. I hope you did so surrounded by friends and family and chosen family, however you like to celebrate. I definitely missed my family this weekend, but it was good to talk to them. And actually, our neighbor invited us over for Easter dinner with her family. It was very sweet of her. Got to practice my really bad Portuguese. Most of them spoke English, but I did get to practice a little bit with my Portuguese, and they had a mostly traditional Portuguese Easter meal. They explained that often the meal would involve lamb, and nobody felt like cooking lamb, so they just had other traditional dishes. And then they had about 92 different varieties of dessert. It wasn't that many, but it was a lot of dessert, which I am always on board for. Here they don't dye Easter eggs like we do in the States, or hide plastic eggs filled with chocolate. But there was one kid there, he was 9, and they did kind of a modified Easter egg hunt for him, and so that was fun to watch. They exchange almonds, what I would think of as like Jordan almonds, that kind of almond, or chocolate colored almonds. They had milk chocolate and dark chocolate and white chocolate covered almonds, and so that's more of a tradition of exchanging almonds. My one friend who's Portuguese called it swapping almonds. So that's a new tradition that I learned a little bit about. In addition to that, it's that time of the year when my allergies are just insane. I feel like a walking pharmacy with everything that I carry around with me. Eye drops and nose spray and my inhaler and allergy pills, just wreaking havoc. The need for sunscreen does not help. Trust me, I'm not going to stop using sunscreen, but every once in a while it will just irritate the snot out of my, literally kind of the snot, not out of my eyes, but out of my nose, but my eyes will just get so irritated, even though I'm incredibly careful about applying the sunscreen. But you don't want to know about all this. You would probably like to hear about books and maybe listen to an interview with an author of a book. How about several books? A series of books. The Westward Sagas, in this case, is the series of books. We are talking about the 5th book in this series. The author is David A. Bowles, and we're talking about, as I said, the 5th book in this series. It is called The Sheriff of Starr County. This is a series of books, but they can be read as standalone books. We'll talk about this more, but he started writing a historical fiction, but based on people that he found in his own family tree, and this is no different. The main character in this book, Will Smith, is a Texas Ranger and is part of David's family, and so he researched that story, and it became the 5th book of this Westward Sagas series. But like I said, you can read them as standalones. Let me go ahead and give you the description of this particular book. When Texas becomes a newly minted state, good men and women work hard toward progress and peace. Texas Ranger Will Smith travels to the borderlands of the Nueces Strip to become the first sheriff of Starr County. He'll do what he must to bring justice to the frontier, including wrangling outlaws, navigating political intrigues, fighting Indians, and keeping the tenuous peace between the Tejano and Anglo residents. He encounters influential statesmen and entrepreneurs of early Texas, assists the U.S. Army, and falls for 2 very different women. This is based, as I said, on the author's own ancestors. And it will teach you a little bit about this particular era of Texas history. As I said, can be read as a standalone. I have mentioned before, and I talk a little bit, well, we talked a little bit before we started recording and a little bit during the interview, that I used to live in Texas, in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. And so I learned, some about Texas history while I was there, and it was interesting to learn a little bit more, maybe a little bit more about an area and a period of time that I wasn't as familiar with. Let's go ahead and start the interview with David. Again, this is David A. Bowles. It is the Westward Sagas, and this particular book is called The Sheriff of Starr County. Hi, David. Welcome to the podcast.
Well, thank you, Sarah, for having me. Great to be here.
Yeah, thank you for being here. I'm excited to have you. We're going to talk a little historical fictions, a Western, and that's fun. But before we talk about your series and your newest book, if you could share a little bit about yourself so my listeners can get to know you just a bit, that would be wonderful.
Well, I'm a fifth-generation Texan. Family arrived here in 1836, and I'm in the fifth generation, and I was a businessman for many years, and I was a late bloomer in the writing field, I worked for an international wine and importing company for 26 years, and then went into business for myself. And when my daughter got where she could take over the business, so I became a full-time writer. So I'm a late bloomer. I wrote my first book when I was 60 years old.
There's nothing wrong with that. It sounds like you went through a few phases and that they brought you to where you are.
Exactly.
Yeah, wonderful. So this newest book, Sheriff of Starr County, is part of a series, which is the Westward Sagas. Can you give an overview of that series?
Yes, the Westward Sagas the Sheriff of Starr County is the fifth book in this Westward Saga series, and it's a sequel to the book 5 about Will Smith, a real Texas Ranger, and his adventures with the Indians and fighting the Mexicans in Mexico, and he had quite an adventurous life, including a couple of love stories. He had a hard time with his love life, but it was quite an interesting story to write and to read.
And what about Will Smith as a Texas Ranger made you want to, write books about him, write his story?
Well, he was a family member, and he went after a nephew that was captured by the Indians on his own, by himself, out into the Comanche. And I kept saying, "Oh man, that's a great story. It's got to be told." And as I read and researched it, and it was a wonderful story about him. And that book is the previous book, the Comanche Trace, which was a story of both the abducted boy's journey and Will's journey looking for him. And it turns out to have a happy ending.
Which is good. And yeah, it's referenced in this book. And then did you know that you wanted to write a sequel, or did you come to that after you'd finished that first book?
I named the series the Westward Sagas for a reason, because my family, originally the book started, and it's kind of, my Westward Sagas kind of misdirects people because it's not a one of those bang bang shoot 'em up type book westerns that you see. It's a little bit different. And people used to say, well, gosh, David, Greenville, North Carolina, where the Battle of Guilford Courthouse was fought, said, that hasn't got anything to do with the West. And I said, well, in 1781, it sure as heck did, because everything west of Philadelphia was the West. And so it didn't become the Western theme until the fifth book, because it was all about as they moved from Greensboro, North Carolina to Tennessee, and then from Tennessee to Alabama, and then eventually once Texas opened up in 1836, then they decided to move to Texas. So it's always been a westward movement, and the entire series will cover all the way to California before if I'm able to keep writing it'll end up on the West Coast.
So westward is really the key word there. Not, it's not a Western. You got to pay attention to the westward in there.
And I had people, that mentioned that. Well, I had one guy gave me a great review, but he says there was no bang bang shoot 'em up, and I thought that's good. That's what I didn't intend it to be, a bang bang shoot 'em up.
Right, absolutely. Do you have a number of books in mind for the westward sagas until they get to California?
Yes, I definitely have one that right now that I'm working on, and it's quite a story about the development they were involved in the development of Los Angeles.
Okay. And how about this one, Sheriff of Starr County? What was the inspiration for this story?
This inspiration was after the war with Mexico, and the the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed. It changed the border of Texas. There was a border dispute that had been going on since the peace treaty between Mexico and the Republic of Texas. And that border was based on, as far as the Texans were concerned, it was the Rio Grande River. But the Mexican government figured it was the Nueces River. And for many years, those people living between the Nueces and the Rio Grande really didn't know who they belonged to, but they spoke Spanish. And so when the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed, overnight they became American citizens. They didn't speak English. Will was appointed the sheriff to come into an area as large as the state of Tennessee, was the only lawman in an area that no one spoke English. And he had his hands full, but he did a very good job of keeping peace on what the Texas borderlands. And it makes a great story. And it goes into the compromise of 1850, where Texas relinquished 63 million acres to the federal government in 1850. And it has that story, and there's a lot of intrigue involved in it, and it's factual history, even though I've had to make up some characters that were fictional. Most of the characters in there, including old Sam Houston, is factual, and the events actually happened.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned that Will is an ancestor, a relative of yours. How did you know that your whole life? Did you find that out doing research about your family, doing genealogy? How did it come to know that you had a Texas Ranger in your family tree?
That's a very good question. And I'll tell you, I first learned about the story on the front porch of my parents' home. We sat around in the afternoon. I grew up in an area where we didn't have TV. And so we sat on the front porch and told a lot of stories and entertained ourselves, kind of. And the story about Fayette being captured by the Indians came up. And I was intrigued by it at an early age. I was about in the first or second grade. And I just kept that in my mind. I said, how could this little boy my age walk all the way from Austin, Texas, to Taos, New Mexico, with his Achilles tendons had been cut by the Indians so he couldn't run away? And I started really researching that, and I was amazed how much information I could find. And then when I found out about Will going after him, I assumed, he got a big posse and and went after him. But no, he had a posse that wanted to go with him. And Sam Houston had suggested that, he shouldn't go off alone. And he says, look, I have no intention of taking the Comanches on. I'm going to barter with them, for I know what they want, and they want to trade. And I'm going to take silver with me so that I can trade. And I just got so involved in the story, and it's a matter of, it's in the archives of the Texas Archives up in Austin. Some of the events, including the pay that he received for some of his efforts in Texas, and so it's there. And I just really got excited about it. But of course, there was an interview by Fayette in about 1906. About 1900, because he died in 1906. And Fayette told the story for the first time. I guess he knew he was fixing to die, and he told the story of his journey. And then Will's story became pretty well known. And he was, like I said, a Texas Ranger. He fought in the war with Mexico. And then the governor of Texas would be at that time. Yeah, he was governor. Texas was a state at that time when he was appointed to be the sheriff of Starr County. And so all of that's a matter of public record, and it's I had to fill in the blanks, and I filled in a couple of love stories, and they're pretty neat that he had. They didn't end well. He lost his loves. Actually, he had three loves in his life, and they didn't work out. Let's put it that way. Not a divorce or anything like that, but I don't want to reveal too much about it. But he ended up a bachelor, and we're pretty sure that the town of Smithville. You ever heard of the town of Smithville?
I have.
Well, it's named for William Smith.
Okay.
And of course, unfortunately, the name Smith is pretty hard to. But the fortunate thing about Will is he had a middle name, Witherspoon Smith. And I've been working with some folks out of Bastrop, that's the county that Smithville's in. And no one is for sure whether it was named for him or another William Smith. So I didn't put that in the book, but I have pretty good reason to believe that Smithville was named for him, but I have not been able to document it.
We're going to pick up with this conversation in just a minute, but it is time to go ahead and take that first break of this episode. When we come back, we'll be talking about some of the source material that David used for creating these stories. Stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
The GSMC Life and Happiness Podcast takes you on a journey of exploration. We'll discuss tried and true methods alongside the latest trends of how to best live your life to its fullest and happiest. From psychology to meditation, science to self-help books, the GSMC Life and Happiness Podcast will help you to discover what makes you happy and how you can live life being the best you possible. Download the GSMC Life and Happiness Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and my interview with author David A. Bowles. We are discussing his Westward Sagas series, the most recent of which is called The Sheriff of Starr County. You've got your family history, and I would assume that a lot of that is oral history that's been passed down. So how was that process to then start going to look for source materials? You mentioned the archive. What was that research process like for you?
Well, the greatest research thing is that in about 1980, I was the only one in the family that seemed to show any interest in researching the family. And an uncle brought me the Bible and said, David, you should have it. So I had Austin's first daughter's Bible. Matter of fact, it's right here by me. I can reach over and touch it. And in that Bible had so much information. And it led me, I just did research. I mean, I'm talking 20, 30 years of research. And I'd find just a little bit of information. And then I was fortunate enough to find people that had another Bible that had kind of confirmed what Eleanor's Bible said, dates, times, deaths, and that sort of thing. And so I had pretty much a wealth of information in that Bible as far as vital statistics were concerned. But I had to really dig deep, and it was letters that were handwritten that I found that really gave me the stories. And it was a tedious task trying to transcribe some of those cursive letters. But I did it, and the story began to come out. And if I could go on a little bit, I'll give you an example. I said there was a letter from Louis Jones to Fayette's mother, Angelina, telling about the boy had been delivered to him in Independence, Missouri. And we're talking 1843. And that a good Samaritan in Tiles had paid the ransom for him to the Indians and put him on a wagon train back to, and that the boy had given him enough information to know where his mother lives and that sort of thing. You know, he's 9 years old. He's a pretty sharp kid to survive what he did. And Louis Jones writes this letter to Angelina. I get a little choked up now when I tell this story. He wrote this story to Angelina, and it was sent to Austin, Texas, like general delivery. And it was in September of 1843. And he says, on the outside of the envelope, and I have a copy, it's in the archives at the Center of Texas History at the University of Texas in Austin, the original. I have only a copy, and boy, it was hard to decipher, to do, but I did it, and I had some help doing it. But he writes, he says, Ms. Angelina Jones, I have your boy in my safekeeping. He's here. He's in good health. He's had a very rough time of it the last 3 years with the Indians. But he's here and will remain here until I hear from you, and that sort of thing. And he went into great detail of trying to break the story to the mother about how difficult the 3 years with the Indians had been, and trying to, prepare her for what she would see, because he was in pretty bad shape. And I didn't have any idea who Louis Jones was. You have any idea who Louis Jones was?
It doesn't sound familiar, no.
Well, a lot of Louis Jones. He was a founder of Independence, Missouri. I had no idea. The book had already been finished. I'm talking now about book 4. That was Comanche Trace, and that book had been finished. And I started. I just wondered, who was this Louis Jones? And Google is wonderful. You asked me, you can find out just about anything you want on Google.
Yes,
I typed in Louis Jones. All I knew about him, his name was Louis Jones, and he was from Independence, Missouri. Typed Independence, Missouri, and it comes up, founder of Independence, Missouri. He was a founder. His home is still there. It's now a historical monument. But the guy was, it's just, and great people kept popping up. But he was the guy that saw to it that Fayette got back to Texas. And once I found that letter, I couldn't be stopped. I had to know more. But that letter from Louis Jones told me much, because what he was doing was telling the mother what the boy had told him. And so I know it was accurate. Mm-hmm. And so that's some of it. But I tell you, these things fell in my lap, Sarah. And it's kind of like in all my books, this stuff just landed in my lap and gave me so much information. And I found it mostly when I wasn't looking for it. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's wonderful.
You know? And so, and so it's just something that I had to write. And that's why I wrote it. I couldn't find anybody that, I tried to find a ghostwriter because I didn't have the education I didn't go to school to be a writer or an author, but I could write and I could read. So I figured it out. And I love to do dialogue. Most authors I talk to, they'll tell me, "Oh God, I couldn't write a fiction. I couldn't do the dialogue." I find the dialogue is so easy for me. I don't know about Sarah. I know you do some writing, but dialogue doesn't bother me at all. I love it.
Well, that's wonderful. I mean, that's great, because since you are writing historical fiction, you have to have conversations. So that's great. You can take the research that you have and then put it into those conversations.
Well, I might say that I wrote a narrative of the family many years ago. And, basic genealogical vital statistics, born, died, married, and that sort of thing. And I noticed that the young people in my family found it very boring, and they really didn't pay much attention to it. But once that I turned this story into a series of historical fiction, they got excited about it and they read the stories.
Which is very cool, because there is a statistic, and I don't have a source for it, but it sounds plausible. Let me just put it that way, that a lot of people can't name grandparents beyond like their great grandparents. They don't know those generations, because it is kind of boring to memorize those names and dates, right? Yeah. But to have that story is great.
And that makes, the story, and that like I said, I started this book, the series, really for my family. In my first book, Springhouse, people say, "Well, I can tell that was a story you wrote for your family," because I was very methodical in it, methodical to the point that I made the book clunky, if you realize what I mean, because I said, "Now this was Uncle so-and-so," I made it a little bit too, I wanted to make sure they understood who was who and what was what. So I overwrote it. That's the word. I overwrote that first book because I was trying to make sure that my family understood who their patriot ancestors were, because they were involved in the American Revolution. So the whole story starts, comes on down. They came over from Ireland and they ended up in Texas, and some of them will eventually end up in California.
Fascinating. That's great. In terms of this book, the newest book, and Will as the main character of that book, can you talk about him as a character and what might resonate with readers when they're reading his story? Well,
he became a hero, and he went in there. I don't know if you know the stories of the Texas Rangers during the Mexican War or not, but the Texas Rangers took revenge on the Mexican people, a lot of them, for the carnage that from the Battle of the Alamo and Goliad. And matter of fact, when they would go in and raid a village or something, they would holler, "Remember the Alamo, remember Goliad," and they were pretty mean. And so the Mexican people feared them. And so when Will came into this town, which the town was just in the process of being named, and Rio Grande City, which is an actual real town, it's the county seat of Starr County. Starr. Everybody thinks a star, but it was named for a man by the name of Starr. And anyhow, he had to take over being the law for a bunch of people who really there hadn't been any law in Rio Grande Valley at that time. And it's almost reverted back to that now, Sarah. Rio Grande City is the center of everything that's happening down on the Rio Grande border right now that you see on TV every day. And but we won't get political, but anyhow, it was wild and woolly then, and it's wild and woolly now. And he meets a young lady. I won't give you too much of the story. I want people to read the story. Don't want to ruin it for anybody. But he meets a young lady that turns out to be quite a lady, and he actually meets two ladies. And I'm going to leave it at that. It's just a nice story, and there's a great love affair in there.
Mm-hmm. How is it when you've got these great characters, most of them are real people, you did have to create some to make the story flow. So when you sit down to develop characters, some of whom are real, what's your process for developing a character that's based on a historical figure, and how do you flesh that character out?
The real ones, I have to figure out, reading the letters and mail. You could find out what kind of person they are by some of the things they do. I mean, I knew Will's true grit when I read about him going off alone to go after this boy. He didn't want anyone with him. He was going by himself. And matter of fact, his ranger captain, who was a guy by John Coffey Hayes, a famous Texas Rangers, was his boss and tried to stop him, but he couldn't stop. He couldn't keep him from going. But it's talking about Will. I created him. I got to tell you a little side story. Is I had no idea what Will looked like. And I don't know if you have a picture of the Sheriff of Starr County or not, the cover, but you see he's got a mustache and all that. I had no idea what he looked like, but I created it in my own mind, and I had the graphic artist send it. And he had a brother named Fenwick that was much younger. Well, we don't have any pictures of Will because the camera hadn't made it to Texas yet in the time period that he was the sheriff. But the camera did make it down to Austin, Texas in 1880, and they had a picture of his brother, Fenwick Smith. And I found that through a very distant cousin who he sent it to me. And it looks just like the Will that I described that's on the cover. And I've had that happen to me in several of my books where I started trying to describe a person. And we didn't have pictures of our family back then. We pretty well just had the stories and the letters and things like that. But now I want to step over to what I love creating is the fictional characters. And in this book, The Sheriff of Starr County, one of his loves is a fictional character, and she is a character, and she is a tough woman. And one of the things in the line, she owned a cantina, and there was a bandito that was trying to steal one of her girls out of the cantina, just physically grabbed her and was yanking her outside. And Norma was the cantina owner. It was Norma's Cafe. And she went and said, "No, you're not taking him." He said, "Yes, I am." And she pulled a gun out of her waist and shot him. Well, Will's the sheriff, and that's his girlfriend. And they had a long time relationship going with. One of the neat things that was said, they carried him off. The guys that was there they were from Mexico, and they wanted to get back across the border because what they were doing wasn't quite legal. The sheriff was coming, so they drug him out and got him across the river before the sheriff could get there. So Will asked her, he said, "Well, what did the guy look like?" And she says, "Well, he's dead and he's got a hole in his head." that was how tough she was.
Oh, geez. Wow.
I said, "Yeah, he's got a hole in it. You find him, he's got a hole in his head." And so it turns out to be a real cute story, and a lot of real things happened, and then I mixed in a lot of creation, and I've done it in such a way that readers tell me, "So you can't tell, David, when you started creating, or which is it?" And that's what I intended to do.
I'm going to jump in here so we can take our second break of the episode. We'll be continuing this conversation when we come back, so stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I'll be right back.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be, visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast. As you know, I am interviewing author David A. Bowles this week. We are talking about his Westward sagas. Let's get back to that interview.
One of the greatest history books ever written was Gone with the Wind. And Margaret Mitchell, that wrote that book, that's the only book she ever wrote. She did a great job of making children, and I remember I was only 9 or 10 years old when that came out, but I went and saw that show, and then I began to realize what the Civil War was all about, and it was about the people. It wasn't about the fighting, and she did a great job in that thing. And I guess I've seen it about 10 or 12 times, and every time I see it on TV, I go back. But that's what I wanted to try and do. I wanted to create something like that, a story that people liked, but also told them the story of what it was really like during that time period. And I think I've done a pretty good job of that, Sarah.
Mm-hmm. And, you know, your family members are obviously learning things about their family. What do you hope just your everyday reader might take away from the book and the series?
You know, I had a lady from Japan that gave me a review that I loved. And she said that, you know, she has a PhD and she teaches mathematics at Texas A&M. And she reads well. She has a little problem with the language. And she really didn't know, you know, she came here when she was about 20 years old, came here to get her PhD. And she said that my books taught her about American history from the Revolution and not so much about the war. So many books get into the war, the battles, and somebody's head got blown off and this and that. I try and make the story about the people and how these epic events in American history affected the people that lived there. And that's kind of what I wanted to do, and hopefully I'll continue to do, is that each time I write a book, it'll be about another epic event in American history.
Wonderful. Yeah, I was a history major, but I agree completely. It was never the dates, the wars, the politics. They're important and they lay a structure. But I've always been a social history person, and those letters and the journals and the daily lives of people.
And you from those letters, if you really, that's something that we've gotten away from. Those letters kind of told the character of the writer. I mean, you could listen to the words that they say and how they said them, and they may have misspelled them. And, you find all kinds of little SIC markers, you have to do a lot of that. Because the words that they used back then, there's some words that they use that just don't exist anymore. And but you can get the gist. And then what I learned by their deeds, I learned about the things you'd read about somebody giving somebody some land or something to get a start, or they help build a church, or somebody's barn burned down and the neighbors gathered together to rebuild it. You'd find those I found that a lot in the research about things that happened. And one of the things that I found was in a journal that belongs now to the LDS library in Utah. But I found the records about my, guess he would be my great grandfather, who was Mustang. And I haven't written about this yet, but I've got the story there. And this Mormon missionary came along and wanted to know what they were doing. And this information is from the Mormon missionary's name, who I've forgotten at the moment, Thomas something. But anyhow, he came along, and they were chasing Mustangs and corralling Mustangs. You know what, Matt? You lived here long enough to know what Mustangs are. The wild horses in the brush.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And so he went down, and he asked him if he could watch or predict. They said, well, hell, you come on and go with us. We'll put you to work chasing these Mustangs. Preston Thomas was the name of the missionary, LDS missionary. Back in those days, they were called Mormons. That rode with them for the Mustangs, and he wrote the story about how they herded them up, ran them into a little ravine, and then they were able to get ropes on the young horses, which were easier to train, and they hauled them off. And that's how the family back then was living down on Coletta Creek in South Texas, and they were doing what was called mustanging. And I thought that was a great way to live. I wouldn't want to do it today, but they had a good life there, mustanging. And thank you, Sarah, for letting me tell that story.
Oh, well, it's just fascinating to learn things that we don't think about much nowadays.
That's right.
Yeah. So you're working on the next installment of the series, is that correct?
It'll be book 6, and I've got 2 or 3 ways to go on it, and I haven't. It's one of those things it's up here, and I'm trying to make up my mind which characters to go with. Bring in some new characters, but Will's getting up in age, so So I'm not, and that's one thing I don't have on Will is to know exactly when he died. There seems to be no record of it. So I'm going to have to create that, I guess.
Oh, that will be an interesting exercise, I think.
Yes.
Yes.
And then I could skip and go to another character that I have, and his name is interesting, King Heffington, King Henry Heffington. They actually named the boy King. Obviously, they were they liked the royalty, I guess, but they named the boy King.
That's pretty high expectations, though, for a kid.
Yeah, and they called it, as he's a grown man, and he married my grandmother's sister, and they were cattle drivers, and I'm thinking about going with that story, and maybe Will's days are just about gone, so I'm just trying to make that decision. I know I have some readers who I use as advanced copy readers, and they want to hear more about Will. And that's the thing, when you write a good character, they don't like it when you cut them out.
Right.
They want to know what happened to Will.
Yeah, that's the hard part about writing about real people. You can't just keep them going indefinitely when their lives didn't go indefinitely, right?
That's right. One of my readers that lives near me here as a neighbor, I asked her about, when she'd finished the book, what she thought of it. And she said, well, I didn't like the ending. And I said, oh, and, my feelings were a little hurt. I said, what could I do to make the ending better? And she says, well, I didn't want it to end. So that was a great compliment that she gave me, that she didn't want it to win. Yeah, but I've had several lately. Really, I've made Will such a character, a strong character that they want to hear more about him. And so I guess I guess he gets snake bit or something. I don't know.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that'll be interesting.
Yeah.
So in terms of writing, you came to it a little later than some, maybe, and you came to it for a specific reason, in that you're writing about your own family's history. What made you decide to then write to publish your stories?
Well, people kept asking me to, and kept saying, you need to write a story. You need to say, I'd written up some little short stories about it, and they said, you need to write a book. And I didn't, the thought of writing a book, I didn't know anything about it. But when I got into the wine business, I didn't know anything about it either. So I guess I just jumped off into it, Sarah, and I'm glad I did. And I really enjoy writing. And someone recently asked me, why do you write? And I write because I can't not write. Does that make sense?
It does, yeah.
I have to sit down and write something. I get an idea. I've got to put it in my own words.
Mm-hmm.
And I've got files and files here of stuff that I've written and never done anything with. But maybe it's the family can someday do something with. Mm-hmm. Or if I've got a granddaughter I'm sorry about that. I had my phone turned off, and I turned it back on because I thought you might call.
Oh, no problem.
Yeah, so I'll turn it off now. But I hope I answered your question there.
Yeah, and you, obviously you said it really well. I write because it's in you to write, and those stories are there, and so you're getting them out. But from that experience, and not necessarily knowing what you were doing when you started, what advice would you give to someone who was thinking the same thing? They have stories that they want to tell.
I tell us, and it's not a cliche. I've heard it before, but it's very important that if somebody's starting a writing career, that they have a steady source of income from other sources. Because you and I know that even when you get the book written, and even whether you go independent or traditional publishing, there's going to be a long period of time, as an example, the way the bookstores and the online stores pay you. You're looking at, from the day a book is sold, you're looking at 90 days before you'll ever see a penny of it. And depending on whether you have an agent, this and that, I have an old saying that in the book business, the author is the last person to be paid. And that's something someone needs to think about. If they're writing a book to make money, they really need to think seriously about that, because very few books sell. I think I just saw it. Somebody has one of the books. I don't know if it was B&W or what it was, but that only very few books sell out over 5,000 copies, and some of them don't do 500 copies. And so you can do the math, whether you're selling through Amazon and getting a 70% commission, or you're getting a 50% commission. Not a lot of money there, and you have to be cognizant of that. That's the best advice I could give to anybody wanting to become an author.
Mm-hmm. Go into it with your eyes open. Yeah, makes sense.
Yes.
Let's go ahead and take our final break of this episode. When we come back, David will be talking about what he likes to read. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I'll be right back.
The Golden State Media Concepts Travel Podcast, the show that gives you advice on everything travel. We explore places you've always wanted to go, as well as giving tips for traveling in those places. We'll give you advice on the best sites for travel tips, information, and discounts. Join us as we travel the world, explore cultures, and meet new people. The Golden State Media Concepts Travel Podcast has got you covered. Download the GSMC Travel Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and the conclusion of my interview with author David A. Bowles. When you take time to read, you're not doing research, you're not working on a book, but you take time to read just for you, what are your favorite genres and authors?
Well, I love Larry McMurtry's Lonesome Dove. It was a tremendous series. I loved reading it. I read the one Dead Men Walking. I read it about 3 times. They were pretty accurate on that in their book on the history of that walk. That was a true event, that those men got captured by the Mexican army, and they walked from Santa Fe, New Mexico to Mexico City. Some of them were barefoot. And that's a true story. A lot of people don't realize that when they watch that show. But that story of Dead Men Walking was a true story.
Just it's baffling when we're so used to cars to think of walking that distance under good circumstances, let alone under hardship, right?
I'm going to tell you, driving a car from Santa Fe, New Mexico to Mexico City would be quite a challenge. Well, yeah. It's about 2,000 miles. 2,000.
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah. And so though that I like reading things that I can relate to.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
I can relate to, and I don't like the bang bang shoot 'em up, all fiction book, pure fiction, as they call it. I don't care for that bang bang shoot 'em up stuff too much. Some of those books, if you get to reading them, all they do is just change the name of the cowboys.
Yeah.
And the color of their horse and that sort of thing. And I liked it. I try to put some factual history into my works. And there are some, we had a gentleman who wrote contemporary Western works, and that was, Elmer Kilton. And you may have heard of him when you were living here in Texas. Elmer Kilton was in San Angelo, and he wrote some really wonderful stories about, one of them that comes to my mind is, Will It Ever Rain Again? And we're wondering that right now. That story, but he wrote something he wrote things that I can relate to, and quite a few others, because Elmer Kelton sold quite a few books, and I try and write a little bit like him, but he was his own person, and he came from the journalistic side of writing, and anyone that's ever been a journalist, they're taught they've got to make their sentences short and sweet. And that's kind of the way he wrote, but he wrote some good stories. And he was all of his was totally, totally fiction, except that he took them from people that he knew, families, and he would change the name.
Okay.
That's one of the things you have to do when you do contemporary. You can't be talking about somebody's aunt and uncle. You got to be careful what you say.
Yes, you do. Absolutely. David, how about internet presence? Do you have a website, an author website, and what social media could people find you on?
Yes, I have a website about David A. Bowles, author.com. And my series, I have a separate website for the series, westwardsagas.com. And that's spelled just like, Western, westward, and W-A-R-D, sagas.com. And both of them have similar information. One of them deals a little bit more about me and a few more pictures about me, and quite a few short stories that I've written that are 250 to 500 words that people might get a little sample of for free of my writing.
And actually, it's good that you've got both, because if you're looking for David Bowles, author, you're not the only one.
That's right. There's another David Bowles, and he lives in Texas. He writes primarily children's books. And I tell you, a friend of mine that just went online, his wife went online and bought a book for him for his birthday or something. And he's called me up and he says, "What are you doing writing children's books?" And I said, and that's the first time I heard about this guy, but he's apparently very prolific. He's got a lot of books, and I haven't read any of them. They're not, what I'd be interested in, children's books, But he's got a lot of books out there, so people do get us mixed up. And that's why I added on this book David A. Bowles to try and differentiate from us. But still, there's something on the internet now that it's about my book, but it's the Lone Star Literary Association. It's got his picture in there, but my books.
Oh, wow.
Well, and those things will happen. There's not much you can do about that.
He has as much right. We'll meet someday.
He has just as much right to his name as I do.
Oh, absolutely. Yes.
Yes. That's right.
Well, I want to thank you so much for your time. Is there anything that we haven't covered as we've been talking that you want to make sure that you highlight?
Well, Sarah, I just want to say I hope your audience will grab a copy of my book and read it. As they know, they can go online to Amazon.com and read it for free. Get an idea, read the first few pages, and see if they like it, and go from there. I don't want anyone to think for a minute that my books have to be read 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. They're standalone books. Each one, there's enough backstory to kind of bring somebody up to date. Ideally, having the whole set is a great idea. But, there are different time, the different time periods. But you don't have to read this series chronologically. And I like to make sure everybody knows that. I get asked that all the time. And I guess every series writer gets that. John Jakes that wrote can't remember his family. He wrote about his family. He had the same issue. People thought, well, you had to read them. But no, you don't. You don't own my books anyhow. There's enough backstory. So I want to make sure your listeners knew that.
Perfect. That's very good. That's good information. Thank you so much. And thank you for taking the time to talk to me about the series and the Sheriff of Starr County. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you once again to David for joining me to talk about not only the Sheriffs of Starr County, but also the Westward Sagas and writing and reading and all of those fun things, Texas history. If you are a fan of history, Texas history in particular in this case, if you are a fan of Westerns, although as David himself said a couple of times, not the shoot 'em up, bang bang kind of Westerns, but a little more sedate in terms of Westerns. But if you're a fan of that genre, if you're a fan of books based on family history, then you will definitely want to check out the Westward Sagas. Again, they are standalones, as David said. You don't have to read them in order. You can, of course, read them in order. There are currently 5 out, so that's always exciting. You know me, I love when I find a series and there are multiple books out and I can read them all in a big chunk. So if that's something that you love, then this is an opportunity to get in and read 5 books in a connected series, moving ever further west. So thank you to David. Thank you, of course, to you, my listeners, for joining me. I hope that you will join me again on the next episode when author... And you heard me hesitate there because I just realized that I do not have any idea how to pronounce her last name. I will find that out, of course, for the next episode. Her first name is Patty. Her last name is spelled Mechael. I can think of a variety of different ways to pronounce that. If you are familiar with her, then you probably know how to pronounce her name. But we are switching to YA, and I'm excited to talk to her about her book, The Antidotes Pollution Solution. So looking forward to having Patty on the podcast, and I hope you'll join me for that episode. In the meantime, if you are a fan of this podcast, you know what you can do. Like, follow, subscribe. Reviews are fabulous. And follow on social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. Love hearing from you, interacting with you, and seeing what you're reading these days. So come find the Book Review podcast on social media, and I will love to chat with you a little bit. As always, I hope you're having a great week. Hope you've got something fun planned, but regardless of what your week entails, I hope that it entails plenty of time for you to get yourself lost in some great books. Thank you so much.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.